Hi everyone, and welcome to That's Mental. Welcome back to another episode of Mental Health and the Brain. And today I'm actually starting a sub-series on the topic of trauma. Trauma is a topic that's really important to me and something that I've really been wanting to dive into for a long time. Some of you might recall that I talk about having PTSD from my job at the agency. And to be honest, I used it a little bit as a joke, but I've always believed it and known it to be true. And I've been convinced of the existence of trauma in other areas of life than, for example, for war veterans or victims of sexual abuse. And I've always wanted to find out more about that, dive deeper into it, and really understand what it means. What is trauma? How does it build up? How does it exist? How does it affect our lives? And that's what I really want to get into and bring to you today and in the upcoming episodes. For the record, I really want to clarify up front, and this is really important, I am not at all discounting the experience of war veterans or victims of sexual abuse or other horrific experiences. It's just that most of the time what we hear and read about in the media when it comes to trauma is very much related to those people. And unfortunately, that makes it much harder to find information about different types of trauma that might not be quite so extreme, but you might still be experiencing and having an impact on your life. So, very important to understand everybody's experience is unique. Everyone's experience is important. We're not in a competition here to see who's had the most traumatic experience. I'm just bringing a different perspective to you today. So what is trauma exactly? Let's start at the beginning. In non-scientific terms, it's a very terrible, large-scale, unexpected event that really suddenly happens to you and just gets hot-wired into your brain. It can have a ripple effect into your thought patterns and other behaviors in your life, and it's really hard to kind of overcome it, forget it, move on, right? In some cases, it will also trigger your survival mechanism, your fight or flight response from the reptilian brain. And normally, after your initial survival response is activated in a certain situation, it should come back to normal, because as we saw in my other videos, you get a really high adrenaline, your heart rate increases, and so on. What happens with a traumatic event, though, is that actually your brain and your body never really end up going back to the normal calm state, and they just stay in this constant state of high alert. And every time they're reminded of the traumatic experience that you had, it reactivates this whole system in your body and your brain. It means that you can even get stuck in a repetitive loop as well, constantly replaying this situation through your brain. And this is sometimes something that we see portrayed in the media as well. And this puts you on hyper alert. And that's why we call it PTSD, because basically people can't stop reliving the experience they had for the first time. So let me give you an example here to try and help make this a little bit more concrete. This could be something like witnessing or being in a horrible car accident, right? Or you could be, you could get mugged, you could be bullied, you could be a victim of like verbal or physical abuse. Any of those things, or on a more of a long-term occurrence, it could be, emotional abuse, manipulation, blackmail, and so on. Now, what's going to happen with the word trauma? It implies that this experience sticks with you way beyond the moment in time that it actually happened to you, like I just explained. For example, if somebody shouted at you on public transport tomorrow, you might be a bit surprised or annoyed, but then you would forget about it and just move on. But the problem is with the traumatic experience is that you would live in constant fear of someone shouting at you every time you got on public transport. So if it was with, the getting mugged, you might be constantly afraid the minute you stepped outside your door that somebody's going to jump out and mug you. Or, every time you got in a car, you would be terrified of having an accident, and you would relive this whole experience that you had. And you would be stuck in the exact same feeling of helplessness that you had in the moment, the first time you had the experience. And you wouldn't be able to get away from the fear that it caused you. Like at this point, your prefrontal brain is not activated. We're talking about really primal parts of your brain. So you cannot rationally dissociate. You're just thrown back into the experience as if you were there. And as we've seen in other videos, of course, this affects you not just mentally, but also physically. It has a huge impact on your body. So what does this mean in day-to-day life? How does it relate to your life as a whole? Without going in too deep in this episode, the first step is to think about how this might affect you in your day-to-day life. try to think about any traumatic experiences that you might have had. And again, we're not talking about massive things necessarily, you know, it doesn't have to be as extreme as a car accident. To try and start to develop the awareness of that and ask yourself if anything happened. Some of them might not be accessible to you, of course, you might have pushed it out of your brain, but if they are, just gradually bring it into your consciousness. Again, if there's nothing you can think of right now, that's also fine. But I would say, you know, you might wonder, you might start questioning whether there are experiences that you've had in your life that have been traumatic and had a much larger impact on you than you imagined. And I think that's a good sign, because the key here is just about understanding also how this can affect your behavior, you know, in your adult life. And this might be affecting your behavior in how you interact with other people or how you react in certain situations, and you might not even realize it. And then once you've been able to think of an example, or maybe several, slowly start to ask yourself, how has this impacted you, your life, your behaviors, right? And let me give you an example to kind of help make this a little bit more tangible. When I was a teenager, I was in love with my best friend. And I told this to him several times. I kind of, you know, did this whole declaration of love, which is quite hard, especially when you're a teenager. I think for anybody, but you know, as a teenager, you're awkward and it's just uncomfortable. But the thing is, he never answered. He never actually reacted to anything that I said. And meanwhile, you know, as his best friend, I had to listen to him tell me all of these stories about his girlfriends, his dating life, and so on. And you know, I was really suffering because I really wanted him to see me as a potential girlfriend. And at the same time, I felt really rejected because, you know, he hadn't reacted to anything that I'd said. So you might not think that this is a very traumatic event, but years later, I suddenly realized like how much of an impact this particular event had actually had on my life and my interaction in relationships and dating. I suddenly realized one day that I had this huge fear of rejection. And I know everybody fears rejection, but mine was like irrational, because at some point rejection is just part of life, right? But I was so stressed out and terrified by the idea that basically what it meant was that every time I met a guy, I would get super stressed. I get loads of anxiety. I would start overthinking every single moment, every text, every word. Like I was just reading into it way too much and getting much more stressed than was necessary. I'd get so anxious and stressed that I'd read a lot more into what a guy was doing or saying than was necessary. And especially if you think about the early phases when you meet someone, it's really at that point still quite neutral. You hardly know each other, but for some reason I was like really stressed. And you know, I kind of started asking myself like, what's going on? Why am I overreacting like this? It doesn't make sense, you know? And that was when I realized, yeah, rejection, okay, nobody likes that. So why am I like so terrified by it? And I realized that this story from when I was a teenager, this rejection from my best friend, was something that I was carrying around with me still to that day, that it was really deeply rooted within me. You know, it was a very profound rejection, if you can say it that way, because we were really close friends. And at the end of the day, I was really scared of reliving that kind of like deep rejection from somebody that I was really close to. And that's why it was affecting my behavior, and I was acting like completely crazy when I met guys. Like I said, I know this might be a little bit difficult to understand, might be hard to grasp how this is traumatic, but for me, the most important thing I want to share here is like, this event that happened to me at a certain point in time affected my behavior for 20 years. And essentially, you know, my brain had remembered, had hotwired this memory as being a negative experience, and it wanted to protect me from it at all costs. And I think it was afraid of re-experiencing similar kind of rejection. And you know, that was the moment that I was hotwired into, right? That I couldn't stop reliving. And I would also like to add that it's not necessarily in your awareness, right? Because I had no idea this was going on until I started asking myself why I was acting this way. So you have to understand that these hotwired behaviors are also subconscious in your brain. I think that one of the reasons we find it hard to identify traumatic moments in our life, and we might discard things like this that seem insignificant. You're like, okay, you were just a kid, you know, get over it. You were just a teenager, whatever. This happens to everyone, right? But I think that's also because the media have become so accustomed to portraying trauma as something, you know, like the war veteran who keeps hearing the bombings or keeps seeing somebody die. Of course, that is deeply traumatic. And that is, you know, the portrayal is accurate. It's hot-wired. They're reliving it again and again. But I think that at the same time, what the media have done is teach us that trauma is reserved only for these really disturbing events. And that's what I'm trying to break down a little bit. For me, understanding trauma is understanding what other areas of your life it can show up in, how it's impacting your life and your behavior, like I said. And my main message for this first video is that trauma isn't always what you might expect. It might not be the most obvious event in your life that created a traumatic response. It can also be in the small things, you know, in the details, in things that you thought were normal, in behaviors that you didn't think to question and just accepted as the norm. And I am going to get into this in a lot more detail in some other videos, especially when I talk about emotional abuse, for example. So if you're wondering, asking yourself if you may have been traumatized or if you've had some traumatic experiences that are affecting your behavior, ask yourself, you know, start thinking, okay, are there any moments in life where you're really overreacting, or you know, your reaction seems a little bit disproportionate, a little bit like me with this fear of rejection I had that was just a little bit over the top and really exaggerated, right? Or whether you always maybe end up in the same kind of bad situation or with the same kind of bad types of people, or engaging in bad behaviors or undesirable behaviors. You know, these could all be signs of a trauma that you've experienced and that you're kind of just processing in a way that you're not even aware of. So in this video, I really just want to start to open the conversation and say that trauma has many different faces, and we should really be open to understanding more about it. So stay tuned, because I'm going to be sharing more educational videos soon. So if you like this, then don't forget to subscribe so you can be notified when I publish the next video.